Good day, friends, and welcome to another Word of Gord. Today we're pursuing the next section of Peter Richelieu's A Soul's Journey. And we'll be moving on a few pages as the teacher, Akira, comes by every once in a while and goes over his sort of lecture notes of what happened and make sure that the student is remembering as much as he can remember. And there's a question and answer session also that I'm going to skip. We'll go right to the next section where our protagonist recalls his out-of-body adventures, which I think is what you're all most interested in. It's certainly what I'm most interested in communicating to you. So, I could give a long description of the many incidents which took place the following week, but instead I shall summarize the highlights. On the very first night I managed to make my way to Daphne's cottage, where I found her entertaining friends. I was introduced and had interesting conversations with several of them on current events in the world, on which topics I found them to be very, very well informed. Several movie films were shown for my benefit, depicting the gardens attached to the bungalows in this valley. These gardens were much more beautiful than any I had seen before. And the ones you saw before were pretty nice. When gardens were shown which were not laid out in any way, I saw nature spirits, tiny people who couldn't be much more than 5 or 6 inches high, judging by comparison with the flowers I knew, dancing in and out of the pictures. When they lighted on a flower, the stem gave a slight tremor, as it would as if a large butterfly or bumblebee did the same thing. They are indeed perfect replicas of the fairies described in the books beloved by children of all ages, with one important difference: the complete absence of wings, and this can be understood, for logically wings are quite unnecessary at the level where these nature spirits exist. On the second night I got out of my body, meaning to visit the third sphere once more, but when I found myself hovering immediately above the bed in which my body was lying, the first thing I heard was the voice of Charles speaking to me in a characteristic army dialect. He said, "It's about time you looked me up. I've been here at least 3 times since the night when you and your Indian friend came to London with me. Each time your old body was here, but you had gone. I didn't know where you had pushed off to, so I couldn't follow you. This time I decided to come early so as to be sure to catch up." "My dear Charles," I said, "I'm terribly sorry. I didn't know you had been looking for me, for I had been exceedingly busy and very interested indeed in all that I have seen." "What about going up to your little turret room, which I remember used to be a favorite of yours, and then we can have a long talk, just like old times." Later, Charles said, "I'm darn glad you've been so lucky as to meet Akira, for it worried me after I died to see how extremely depressed and miserable you were. I tried my damnedest to speak to you, but couldn't make you hear. We had been jolly good pals in the old days, even though I always looked on you as donkey's years older than me. I appreciate all you've done for me ever since the days when you started to teach me football and gave me my first lesson in how to hold a bat. What a funny thing life is. My idea used to be more or less to have a good time and get the best out of life that I could, and possibly later to marry some nice girl and have a family. When I first met Akira, he impressed me with the fact that a man doesn't change after death. It is the conditions under which he lives that are different, and I have found that quite true." "Yes," I replied, "I gather from Akira that you have not been exactly miserable. He said you had linked up with some girl who had recently left the world. Is that so?" Did he blush, or was I imagining it? "Yes, it's true enough," Charles said. "I think it passes the time to have a girl pal to wander around with. In her case, I'm afraid it tickles my vanity, for she thinks I'm a hell of a fellow just because I know a little more than she does. She didn't have a very good time in the world, so I suppose this moving around, seeing shows and going to restaurants is thrilling for a time." "Well, Charles," I said, "there's one thing I want to ask you. Is there any sex relationship at your level after you've dropped the physical body?" This time I'm quite sure he blushed, but he went on, "Well, yes, there is, of a kind, and I think most people indulge in it, but it's not quite the same thing as on the physical plane. One leads up to things in the same way, and although I would probably have felt just as shy about talking about my secret love affairs had you asked me the same question before I died, I suppose I just feel a wee bit shy of talking about these things now. Don't forget this book was published, like 50, 60 years ago. I said I didn't mean to be personal. I'm just interested in getting as much information as I can about the differences between conditions in the physical and the astral worlds and at various levels of the latter. I told you about my coming up against Daphne on one of the higher levels where she is studying music. I was very much in love with Daphne when she was alive and would have asked her to marry me as soon as I was able to support a wife. Although we never experienced the physical relationship of marriage, I feel that the platonic association we shall carry on now at these higher levels will not only last through the astral existence, but will be of great benefit to us in our next incarnation. What about coming along with me one night and letting me introduce you to Daphne? Yes, I'd like to. Charles said he'd recently made contact with our father, who had died some years previously. From his description, I gathered that father was living at the second sphere. Charles described how he had found him surrounded by rose bushes. This was as I had known him in my boyhood days. He said that the last time he'd seen him, father was distressed because his Scotch terrier, which had attached itself to him, had suddenly disappeared, and he felt it had been lost. I explained to Charles what had really happened, but he showed little interest. We talked on till a peculiar feeling of restlessness came over me. I just had time to say to Charles not to forget Thursday and visiting Daphne when I woke in my bed with no remembrance of how I got there. It was on Wednesday night that I had the most disturbing experience, a nightmare in which Daphne took part. It seemed that Daphne and I were in a dark cave. For some reason, we could not escape a loathsome gorilla-like creature who was seated on the floor close to us, glowering at Daphne, who obviously attracted it in some horrible way. I know that in my dream I wanted to protect Daphne, but the gorilla was of such size and strength that I knew I would have no chance against it. It seemed highly amused at our efforts to escape, for it emitted wild yells and hoarse laughter as we ran hither and thither around the cave trying to find an exit. Even in my dream, sweat poured from my brow, and I tried to think of Ahira in the hope that he would come to our assistance, but nothing happened. After a little time, the gorilla rose to its feet, advanced toward Daphne, whom it grasped with its horrible, long, hairy arms, and commenced to drag her to the other end of the cave. Daphne screamed and resisted to the best of her ability, and in desperation I hurled myself at the horrible creature, although I had no weapon, and I endeavored to get my hands to its throat in the hope that it would turn its attentions to me. Even now I can still smell the fetid breath of the brute, for in the middle of the fight I woke in my bed, sweating profusely, and with all bedclothes all tangled about me. I haven't the slightest idea what it means, and I shall check up with Daphne as soon as possible. Thursday night was the night I began my career as an astral helper. This was the night on which I had arranged to take Charles to the third sphere. He was late, and when he arrived he was in an agitated condition because, he said, a pal of his, Bill Fletcher, had just crashed and been killed in a raid over London. He asked me to come to him with him and help, so we set out at once for London. Charles knew where to look for Bill, and our assistance was welcomed by 3 inexperienced but eager astral helpers. After about 2 hours' hard work on the part of us all, Bill was persuaded to make the effort of will to free himself from his etheric body, and at once became quite a different person. Charles and I took charge of him. We went with him to his home, where we did what we could to prepare his young wife for the news she would receive the following morning. As Charles then undertook to remain with Bill, saying he knew only too well what the poor devil was suffering, I went back to the scene of the raid to see if I could be of any further assistance. An ambulance passed me, so I decided to follow it. It was driven to one of the big London hospitals, and a stretcher on which a young girl was lying was carefully carried into the building. The same girl in her astral body was walking in a very agitated condition close beside the stretcher. After examination, the body of the girl was carried into one of the wards, already filled with recent casualties. Without any fuss or hurry, and an efficiency at which I greatly marvelled, the girl was put to bed and arrangements were made for giving her a blood transfusion. She was frantically trying to communicate with the doctors and nurses attending to her unconscious body, but after a short time she listened to what I had to say. I told her she would be all right, for intuitively I knew this was so. I told her that it would help if she became calm and watched the proceedings, at the same time using her willpower to aid the efforts of the doctors and nurses. Good advice. I don't know now why I suggested this to her. I hadn't the slightest idea whether it would help or not, but it came to me to say this, and so I did. And for those of you working on your spirit rescue and retrieval work when OBE at night, these are important points. You will notice that your brain or your attitude will say, how do I know how to do this? What am I doing? I'm lost, I'm clueless. And yet at the same time, as you're interacting with the quote unquote victims, you will have innovative ideas. You will just know just what to do and wonder why you know. Well, just accept it. You know because you've done it before, but you've forgotten, basically. I could see quite clearly that there was a thin line of etheric matter stretched between her astral body and physical form lying on the hospital bed, so I knew she was not dead, and was sure she would not die. I stayed talking with her for the rest of my night, and after she had told me the house in which she lived was next door to the one that had received a direct hit, and that she was very worried indeed as to the fate of her old mother, began to give her a little of the knowledge which had recently been given to me. There were other astral helpers moving about the ward, and one of them, whom I had not seen before but who said his name was Jim, congratulated me on my efforts, saying that he wished there were more people with the necessary knowledge who would help in similar emergencies. I had a unique experience during After our next attempt had failed, I heard a chuckle behind me, and there he was. He said he would help us and give us landmarks on each sphere which we must memorize. We linked hands with him, and when I opened my eyes, the scene that met them cannot adequately be described, for it was the most beautiful valley I have ever seen. It was partly wooded, and the ground was covered with thick heather of the varied colours which one sees to perfection in South Africa, but soft to the touch. Intermingled with this, wildflowers bloomed in profusion. Side by side I saw primroses, bluebells, daffodils, forget-me-nots, tulips, wild roses, and the most vivid red poppies that could be imagined. I'm sure no variety of wildflower was missing, for the ground near and far was a veritable carpet of colours and breathtaking beauties. I thought you would be pleased with this landmark, said Akara, for it is called the Fairy Glen. It could be described as the cradle of the Deva kingdom, for it is the valley to which members of this evolution return after they have finished the particular work allotted to them. Allotted. I suggest you both investigate the valley on some future occasion, quietly and unobtrusively, for the Devas have their own methods of keeping away Philistines amongst men. They build a thick wall of astral matter which makes it impossible for any human being to see beyond, even if they knew this place existed. Such walls serve the purpose at this level as do brick walls in the physical world. Interesting. Thought form walls that you can't see. Very clever. Yahoo's not wanted. Once more we joined hands and willed ourselves to the next level, the fifth. On opening my eyes, it seemed uncanny to find that we were standing in an open plain like a desert, except that there was grass in place of sand. In the distance was a huge city with many spires and towers, surrounded by an immense wall. Above the city shone something in the nature of a sun, for it spread a glow over all the buildings which made them shine like gold. That, my friends, is the Golden City, said our guide, and I advise you to visit and study it. You will find it within everything that has ever been thought of or imagined as likely to be found in Orthodox heaven, so much talked of priests and ministers and attached to the Christian creed. The whole city is a huge thought form, and you will find therein thought forms of God the Father, of Christ, his 12 disciples, and the many saints who have figured in the teachings of the Church. To describe the thought forms of God, Father, and the Christ, and the 12 disciples, is not to deny them a reality. It is not a fantasy. These historical figures, these prophets, these deities, all exist in as real a way as you will exist when you're there. I think he's making a point about belief systems here. And as I've said before, or hinted at, in the spirit worlds, sometimes it seems like belief systems are all we have. You will find various communities, societies, landscapes, etc., that are all consensus realities of the belief systems shared by those who live there. That does not make them any the less real. Give some examples on Earth. The rather difficult and challenging reality of North Korea is a consensus reality imposed by and imposed by the elite and agreed to by those who live there. It's a very narrow reality, as we all know, narrow and oppressive, but it is a consensus reality and it is real. Anyway, just to give an example. There are many others, of course. So, just a small point. Heaven worlds do exist, heavens of all religions, and all minor religions too, not just the big majors with millions of adherents. They're all there, let me assure you. Again, we linked hands and willed ourselves to the 6th level. Within a second, we were standing on the edge of a lake which was surrounded by a high wall of rock. In the distance on our left was to be seen a very small opening, and I wondered where it led. Make a clear picture of this scene, advised Akira. This lake is used principally by members of the human race who desire absolute silence for their particular work. There is one sect in the world which evolves entirely through meditation exercises. I won't say there's more than one. They are taught in their lifetime that there is this place in rather the same way that Christians are taught there is a place called heaven. The small boats you see are used by the men who come here, for when they are afloat, it is impossible for one boat to be overtaken by another. This is due to some underwater currents which cause the boats to drift around the entire lake, and it takes 24 hours Earth time for a boat to return to its starting place. And the meditation exercises carried out by these people take exactly that time to complete. I saw you notice the small opening on the left. That leads to another similar but smaller lake, also surrounded by high cliffs. This lake was produced by an individual who sojourned here. One day he was interrupted in his meditation by other human beings using the lake at the same time as himself. The thought form he made was so strong that he produced a lake all for himself. I have spoken to you here in a voice which is hardly above a whisper. Had I spoken in my usual voice, you would have heard it reverberating round the lake like thunder. The people in the vicinity know about this unusual feature and take good care never to make a sound. Because of this peculiarity, the lake is called the Waters of Perpetual Silence. Now I must leave you. You will find no difficulty in returning without my assistance. Many, many landscapes, small and large, are thought forms created by the desires of various inhabitants and visitors. Oh, I'd like to have this. Oh, I'd like to have that. And when they have the sufficient mental powers of imagination, they create it. And as you'll know from earlier, most average folks in the Afterlife series, or when people first get there, and they try to create things by thought, it doesn't always work that well. They need practice. And once you're practiced and focused, and who knows how long that will take, because there is no time there, you can do it really well. You get real good at it, real good. And then you get to a stage where you wonder why you're doing it at all. Which leads as you move on up through the levels to areas where, how shall I say, creativity is infinitely manifest despite the lack of forms around you. A little hint there. As he had surmised, Daphne and I had found no difficulty in retracing our steps, but when we reached the fourth sphere once more saw the fairy glen, we decided to remain there. We noticed there were signs of great activity in the valley, as if some sort of ceremony were about to take place. There seemed to be thousands of inhabitants gathered in the valley. We sat down to watch. Our presence was noted by some quote-unquote officials, and when one of them moved towards us, we rather expected to be asked to go away, particularly as Akara had warned us that our members of our evolution were not always welcome here. The man, who slowly and in a dignified manner floated towards us, had a very fine intellectual head and a spiritual dignity which made us rise to our feet instinctively as he reached us. His costume was strange to us. It resembled that of a Chinese mandarin. The colours of the long coat were exquisite, whilst the embroidery clearly portrayed many of the wildflowers that bloomed in the valley. The expression on his face did not seem to augur trouble for us, so we smiled in return, hoping that our attitude would reassure him. What followed was a little uncanny, for it was a conversation conducted without a word being uttered. Question and answer followed upon one another far more quickly than would have been possible had words been our medium of expression. And I think we'll continue on with this Deva ritual next time. It's quite long, and we'll make this episode rather too long if I go into it now. So, blessings to you all, and that is it for now. And I